Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our community conversation on our master facilities draft plan. We're excited to share an update with everybody tonight, and we will get started at 6 p.m. So just hang tight, and in about 4 minutes, we'll get started with the presentation.
Can you get me a diaper, please? And some wipes.
Once again, good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Cameron Riva, the superintendent of Strongsville Schools, and I'm thrilled to be with you tonight to share the draft of our master facilities plan that's been recommended to address the future of our elementary, preschool, and other facility needs in the school district. So as you may have known, if you've been engaged in other communications we've shared, in recent times, we've seen an increase in elementary enrollment. We're reaching maximum capacity of our elementary buildings, and we needed to answer an essential question for our district is, how are we going to look at master facilities planning to meet this growing needs of students and also address aging buildings? So what we did about 7 or 8 months ago is we got together a group of parents, of staff, of community members, over 60, right around 60 in total, to help us to answer these essential questions for our facilities work, as well as engaged with 50 key communicators that would provide feedback and guidance to us as we work to encapsulate the vision for the future of our facilities here in Strongsville City Schools. And so over these past months, we've worked and answered a variety of questions that we'll go through tonight, looked at an enormous amount of data, and this committee, again, made up of community members, of parents, and some staff, has developed recommendations, a draft plan of recommendations for our master facilities. Also involved in this process has been our Board of Education. Board President Laura Howsam and Board Member Richard Micco have been a part of this committee. And we recently provided an update to the board on this draft master facilities plan last week. And so we appreciate our board's engagement and involvement in this process as well. And so in our desire to ensure that our master facilities plan is meeting the needs of our students and staff, but our parents and community as well, it's time to engage our greater community to get feedback. And that's what today is about. Today is about sharing our plan, giving an opportunity for all of our stakeholders to provide feedback, staff, parents, and community members, and then using that feedback to finalize our recommendations that will ultimately go to the board in a few weeks. And so as we go throughout this, I'm going to turn it over to a couple of my colleagues here in a minute, but I wanted to do some brief introductions. You may see some of the names and pictures on your screen. It may be condensed if it's too small, but joining me are our operations manager, Steve Breckner, and treasurer, George Anagnostou. They'll be available if there's any questions in their areas of expertise, as well as our communications coordinator, Dan Faust, who's standing by for the Q&A at the end to share those questions that you've submitted throughout the presentation. So don't forget, in your email, you have a link from us. That link is live, where if you have questions that come up, ask those, and we'll do our best to get through those today. We will stop exactly around 7 p.m. So if we don't get to them, we'll answer them via email or other means. But ask those questions, and Dan will facilitate a Q&A at the end. And at this time, it gives me great pleasure to turn it over to two of our partners in this work from the architectural firm GPD. So I'm going to turn it over to Abby and Chris to lead us through the next steps of this presentation and sharing our draft master facilities plan with our community. Chris and Abby, it's all yours.
Thank you. It's really nice to be with you all tonight. We just wanted to introduce ourselves before we go through our presentation. My name is Abby Ranieri. I'm the manager of planning and design at GPD Group.
And I am Chris Bader. I'm an architect and project manager. So before we start into the master planning process, as Cameron had talked about, we want to give a quick and brief kind of overview of who GPD is, what we are, what we do. We are a multidisciplinary architectural and engineering firm, designers and planners as well. We started off a humble beginning in 1961 with 4 engineers and 1 architect. And now 60 plus years later, we are at over 650 employees. We are now nationwide, but our heart is here in Northeast Ohio. This is where our headquarters are. This is where it all began. And the wordplay on the right side of the slide kind of gives you an idea of our broad range of services and expertise in what we do. We have a number of departments within the company. One of them, the department that Abby and I are in, is public buildings and education. And really, schools are our bread and butter. And we have some stats here that reflect that claim. We've done over $750 million worth of construction and educational facilities in the past 5 years. Over $300 million of that has been with future-ready learning schools. We have extensive experience in education master planning projects, and we've worked with over 60 districts in the state of Ohio. And here we're showing some examples of some of our education. It is far from our full breadth of our experience, but it does give you a snapshot. We've worked with Amherst, with Lakeview, east of us. We've worked with Berea for multiple schools, Hudson schools, Highland schools, and we were your architects and engineers on your new middle school and on the work done to your high school. So here now we're going to get into the overview of this master planning process, which began 6 or 7 months ago in February and culminated just this past month.
Okay, so that's the last you'll hear about us. The rest of the presentation is going to be all about our work with your district. So this slide is just meant to kind of summarize our planning process with you all. We keep mentioning we've gone through about a 7-month process with a master planning committee, but really our work began summer of 2022. And we were brought on board to assess the existing elementary school facilities. We knew that we were being brought on board with those as our main kind of focus, and that was going to be the backbone of our master plan. And then the rest of the plan would grow from that. So we completed those assessments last summer. We're going to talk about those in a moment. And then the board's facilities planning committee, a smaller group that meets regularly to talk about all your facility needs in the district. We presented out our findings from our assessments, and it was at that time that we knew we were going to be engaging in this bigger conversation. So we knew we needed to form a larger dedicated committee that was going to include more voices and more staff members and more members of the community and parents in the process. So the Elementary Facilities Master Planning Committee was formed, and we had our first meeting in February of this year. And we've met 7 times, and we will have our final meeting in October before we make a final recommendation to the Board of Education in mid-October. So we met and worked through a process, and we are going to share essentially what that process told us tonight. As Dr. Ryba mentioned, we also had a group of 50 additional key communicators that were commenting on the work of the committee as we moved through the process. We have kept regular core team meetings, which would include key central administrative staff and does have some board representation as well as we've moved through this process. And we've also had a number of more specific programming meetings to talk about the very specific needs of what we're hearing is required in the master plan. So this is kind of the work that's been done to date. And then upcoming, tonight we have our update meeting. At the conclusion of this meeting, a survey will go out that will be open through the 29th that we can capture your thoughts and questions about what we talk about tonight through that vehicle. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have a final Master Facilities Planning Committee meeting, and that will finalize the recommendation to the Board of Education. So next, we're going to go through step by step a very kind of high-level summary of the meetings, but we hope it's pretty holistic in nature so that you can see how we started and then how we arrived at our recommendation this evening. So Chris and I are going to kind of tag team the rest of this content, and we'll start with a summary of our initial meeting.
So our first meeting back in February, the focus was more on a much general, higher level view down upon the district. And what we're showing here in this slide is your district map, and the large orange circles reflect your 5 existing elementary schools: Sarrar, Whitney, Chapman, Kinsner, and Muraski. And you essentially have an elementary school in each quadrant of your district, and the Muraski is up there kind of in the center left. We're also showing your other facilities in dark green: your middle school, your high school, your Board of Ed, and then the other sites that the district have are shown in light green. So this overview gives us an idea of the facilities you have, the sites you have, and where they are throughout the district. Just some basic information on your 5 elementary schools. This is showing the existing square footage of each building, the size of each site, and then the years that they were built. 4 out of your 5 buildings are now over 50 years old, Kinsner being the exception, with it being only about 25 years old. Whitney and Chapman are around the same size at 41,000 square feet. Sarrar is a bit smaller at not quite 38,000. Kinsner is the largest of the bunch, closing in at 62,000, and Muraski is just shy of 58,000. And site-wise, Chapman has the largest site of the current 5 elementary schools at just a bit over 16 acres. So none of your sites are overly large. So the first step within the master planning process is to gather information. We can't just come in and say, well, we recommend building new or renovating your buildings. We have to have some kind of information that can back up those claims and give us a certain direction forward. So originally, the district had assessments completed on the buildings back in 2008. But given that we're now in 2023, or last year, 2022, those are pretty old assessments. So we brought out to the site a team of engineers and architects to reassess the buildings. And what that incorporates is doing a detailed visual observation of the site and the buildings of a number of different systems of the building, over 20 different systems that incorporate the various exterior components of the building. So your walls, your doors, windows, your roofs, and then everything on the interior finishes, going through all of the various support systems, such as mechanical, plumbing, electrical, fire alarm, fire suppression. And based on our visual observations, we give those systems a rating, and there is a cost associated with the work needed to bring those systems up to current code standards or energy standards, or costs associated with fully replacing those systems. We come to a final cost to replace or renovate those systems. And there's an industry-wide rule that we call the 2/3 rule, where if the total cost to renovate an existing building exceeds 2/3 the cost of a similar building that is brand new, then we would recommend building new instead of renovating, because at some point you have diminishing returns on the investment you make in these structures. And it's important to note that the district has done a good job at maintaining the buildings. Yet when you have buildings that are now more than half a century old, there's a lot of work that needs done to bring them up to current code, current energy standards. And in addition, the way that students are taught today has changed from how they were taught decades ago. So we're seeing a change in how buildings are laid out. So it's not just the systems themselves, but it's the floor plan of the buildings and how certain spaces relate to other adjacent spaces. So we did a assessment for each building, and starting here with Chapman, based on our total cost to renovate versus the total cost of building new. And we come to the total cost of building new based on a industry accepted cost per square foot model. So in this case, we came to a total renovation cost for Chapman of $12.7 million, but to replace Chapman completely to do a new building, it was over 17 million. So our renovate to replace ratio was in the low to mid 70s. That was over that 2/3 threshold at 66 to 67%. So here we would recommend that Chapman be built new in lieu of being renovated. Kinsner has a much lower reno to replace ratio. No surprise there, because it's only 25 years old. So we would be looking at renovating the building here and not replacement. Muraski is showing an overall reno to replace of 60 to 62%. But here it's important to note the various additions on the building. If you look at that line in green, that's your 2005 addition. So you have a rather large addition that's not even 20 years old. that has quite a low percentage of only 32%. But if you look at the original building and the 2 additions that followed, the assessment shows that reno to replace ratio is well above the 2/3 rule. So we'll kind of talk about that a bit more in the presentation, but here we would recommend keeping that 2005 edition and demolishing and replacing as needed the rest of the building. And then Sarrar, we're at high 60s to low 70s for our reno to replace ratio. And Whitney, the worst out of the 5, is in the upper 70s to the low 80s. So based on that, Whitney is in the worst condition of the 5. This slide here shows enrollment tables over the past 10 years. So back in 2012 to 2013, you had a total student count of 6,169. Looking at what you had in 2021 to 22, so 2 years ago, you had dropped down to just below 5,650. But since 2015 to 16, your enrollment has started to go back up. This slide looks at projected enrollment starting from last year up through 2031 to 2032. And looking at that last column, we are showing a projected student count of just over 6,600. So about a 17% increase from the count based on the 2022-23 school year. And what that tells us is that we have a lot more students coming up that we're going to have to plan for. These numbers here show a total capacity for your elementary buildings of 1,922. That is the design capacity for the building. You can, or for your 5 buildings, you can fit more students total in the buildings than what they're designed for, but you start to run into certain comfort issues and other concerns. Your student count for 2022 and 23 for your elementary buildings was just over 2,400. So we have a difference or a delta of almost 500 kids. That difference is only going to increase up to a bit over 700 9 years from now. So we need to figure out how are we going to house these additional 700 kids. And then just for reference, building enrollment for your middle school and high school here as well. We are showing a larger projected enrollment in 31 to 32 than what you have from last year's enrollment. So your district is once again growing.
I think it's important to note here that because of the nature of some of the high school programming with College Credit Plus and some of the career technical offerings, even though there's a difference between the current enrollment and projected enrollment and capacities in those buildings, you're definitely in a much better place of those buildings being more right-sized for those student populations as compared to your elementary schools. So once we kind of took a couple meetings to talk through some of the existing data on condition of the buildings and on our enrollment and our current capacity, we were able to dive into master planning from a concept level. And it's important to note that between the original facilities planning committee and then this newly formed elementary facilities master planning committee, once we looked at the data about the growth that we were going to experience and are experiencing and the conditions of our oldest buildings in particular, we had a consensus that we did need to look at least part of a new facilities plan. So we knew that we would need to consider Muraski and Kinsner in a little bit different light because of those being at least partially newer buildings or newer buildings. But we knew that our oldest buildings, Sarrar, Chapman, and Whitney, the consensus was that rebuilding those or providing new in lieu of those was the way we were going to move forward. So we looked at a variety of different master plan concepts. The intent here was throw all of our different options on the wall and then start to analyze each of those options and start to kind of cross off what ones we knew wouldn't work for this district. So for example, we threw out everything from one consolidated mega school down to rebuilding, 5 schools to essentially mimic the model that you have now in the district. So we looked at different 2 building configurations, 3 building configurations, 4 building configurations. And again, we were just talking about concepts. So we were asking the committee to consider what that meant from a size, transportation, educational delivery. All of those different things were discussed as we reviewed these options. And even within our first meeting, we were able to take a few off the table. For example, the total consolidation and then even consolidating down to 2 buildings didn't seem like it would make sense for our district. So we were able to kind of capture everyone's thoughts about the remaining options, which were a 3, a 4, or a 5 building plan. And that is how we started moving forward, looking at each of those in a little bit more detail.
So when we started to talk about the elementary schools, we wanted to start off with the committee by discussing the 2 main school configurations to choose from, that being neighborhood schools and grade banded schools. Neighborhood schools are what you have now. They are schools that are kind of tied to one area of the district. It's grades PK through 5, the same grades throughout all of your elementary schools. Some of the pros of that is that each school has a strong connection to the neighborhood community in which it resides. Students are in the building for a longer period of time because they're there for all elementary level grades, K through 5. And neighborhood schools can be easier for transportation, logistics, and for those that bike or walk to school. The other option being grade banded schools. This is where you may have a school that is grades K and 1, and then another building that is grades 2 to 3, another building that's grades 4 to 5. Those are not location dependent. They're not tied to any community or neighborhood. Some of the pros for the grade banded schools are increased teacher collaboration. You have a more equal distribution of students across all of the various socioeconomic backgrounds. And it is easier to ensure equal access to curriculum, resources, and other instructional support. So we had the committee talk amongst themselves about the pros and cons for each of these options.
I think it's also important to note here that we felt that everyone in the room understood neighborhood schools the best because that's what you've historically had in the school district. And what was really great was we were able to have a lot of dialogue with teachers and parents in the rooms. And part of our homework before this session was to read some various articles discussing these different types of models. And it was really great to hear from the staff members and the parents in the room who were able to push back a little bit on some of what are considered to be the pros of grade banded schools because of the way that essentially the message was we still have great teacher collaboration within our neighborhood schools. We ensure equal access to curriculum, resources, and instructional support across our neighborhood schools. So it was really great to hear some of that dialogue and to understand that a lot of those pros that fell under the grade banded school model, we felt like we would be able to provide those same pros in either model. So as we talked through this process, we had a lot of really good conversation among the committee and a lot of good feedback from our educators. And unanimously, more or less, there was consensus that keeping with more of a pre-K through 5 school or a K through 5 school model was what was going to work best for our district.
And here we're just showing what neighboring school districts have done with their new elementary schools: North Royalton, Berea, North Ridgeville, Highland, Brecksview, Broadview Heights, and more. There are quite a number of districts in Northeast Ohio that have moved forward on building new facilities in elementary schools. And you can see the wide range of aesthetics and design for these schools.
I think another piece of why we focused on this during this committee meeting also had a lot to do with reinforcing our decision that some of the districts that moved to a consolidated elementary school, like North Royalton or Brecksville Broadview Heights, they still had a smaller elementary student population that we did. So we were kind of comparing, how other districts tackled their building challenges, but also how they planned their district and the size of their facilities. So that exercise kind of helped reinforce some of our thoughts about what was the right scale of building for this district as well.
So getting more into the meat of our master plan option for the elementary schools, we know that we have a total K-5 projected enrollment of just over 2,600 kids. Kinsner, due to the low renovate to replace ratio we talked about earlier, would be renovated. Kinsner was designed for 500 students. So you take that out of the 2625 and what you're left with is 2,125 students that we need to determine where they're going to go. What facilities are we going to design for them? And we came down to presenting two different options. We called them the orange option and the yellow option. The orange option included 3 total buildings to renovate Kinsner and then build 2 new buildings, each for 1,062 students. The yellow option, same as the orange, keep Kinsner, renovate Kinsner, but here we would be building a total of 3 new facilities, each housing 708 students. So option orange is fewer but larger buildings. Option yellow is more but smaller buildings. For option orange, we would be looking at renovating Kinsner. Then we would need to determine, because we are going from 5 schools down to, or 5 elementary schools down to 3, where we would locate the 2 new facilities. We felt that Albion was a great location due to the size of the site and that there is no existing building on it now. So we don't have to deal with sometimes the logistical headaches of constructing a new building on an already occupied site. So that would then leave Chapman and Sarrar as housing the other site. Due to the student count, 1,000 plus students for elementary schools, it's a large building. So we would, given the size of your sites, we would very potentially be looking at a 3-story building. Not ideal when we're talking about little ones in grades, K through 5. The yellow option would keep a school in all 4 quadrants. We would look at relocating Whitney to Albion because they are so close, and renovating Kinsner, and then rebuilding at Sarrar and Chapman. And for this option, due to the schools being significantly smaller, going from over 1,000 students down to just over 700, we felt that these buildings could much more comfortably fit as 2-story buildings on your sites.
One other thing to note in both of these options is through the work of the committee, We knew that we had elementary needs, but we also knew that because of the condition of the existing board office or the old Zellers elementary, and because of some goals for preschool offerings, that we wanted to be able to address both the central administrative offices and preschool with this plan. And there was some different committee conversations that led to us exploring the Muraski site as being potentially an ideal site to bring the preschool and administrative portions and functions of the district together. It centrally locates them within the district. And then because Muraski did have some portions of the building that needed to be demolished and built new, and just that 2005 portion was still in really good shape, we thought that we wanted to explore that a little further. So we'll get into that as we move forward tonight as well.
So the committee came to a consensus on moving forward with the yellow option. So from there, we started to dive into each site at a much deeper level and see, okay, what can we do with those sites? So we came up with what we call some fit plans. And the purpose of them is just as what they're called, to show what can fit on the site. These are high-level, conceptual, or preliminary plans. They are by no means a final option or the only option of how things can be laid out on each site. But again, it gives us an idea of what we have to work with. So here we're showing the Sarar site, and the proposed new building is shown in red. The existing building is shown with the dashed red line around its perimeter. The new parking is shown in gray, just to the north of the building. And then the two areas in green are showing the proposed playground area and then your multi-purpose field that supports that building. So we can see here at Sarar, we do have adequate room to the west of the existing building to locate the new facility. We would keep the existing facility occupied and in use until the new building is done. We would move the students over to the new facility. Then we would demo the now old facility, and we would move forward on the remainder of the construction, which would typically is the parking and then putting in the playground and the athletic field. This is showing the site at Albion. As I had mentioned just a little bit ago, there is no existing building there, so this would not need to be a swing site. That is, again, where you construct a new building on the same site as having an occupied building. We have more than enough room here to put a building. And what we're showing here is trying to keep the building away from that northern portion of the site where you've got a lot of vegetation and you have a lot of topography or changes in elevation as you go towards Albion Road to the north. And then Chapman. Here again, we show the new building in red. And again, the footprint of these buildings are just one potential option. By no means, and very likely not what that footprint will look like if and when design comes to a close. But here we're showing the potential new building to the west of the existing building, with the playground just behind the building to the west. Once that existing building were to come down, construction would then commence on the permanent parking lot and the multi-purpose field.
So as Chris mentioned, we were receiving buy-in and consensus as we moved through this process at each meeting. We talked about the yellow option in particular for about 2 dedicated meetings, getting a lot of good questions, trying to kind of poke holes into where potential issues could be between the orange and the yellow plans. And once we knew that the group had consensus on Plan Yellow for the new construction portion, we wanted to dive a little bit further into Kinsner and Muraski And so we did a dedicated visit to Kinsner just to observe and make notes about its educational adequacy. So what we're doing there is we're really examining the layout of the building, and we're looking at the building's capacity and flexibility. We're looking at daylighting, and we're looking at safety and security. What we're doing is we're comparing the size and location of spaces, their access to lighting, and the safety and security features of this existing floor plan against if we were going to be building a new one, to make sure that at the end of the day, once we renovate Kinsner, that the educational adequacy of that space is going to be similar to that of another site that might get a new building. So big things we were checking in on were, for 500 students, is the gymnasium sized appropriately? Is the dining room the correct size? Media center? Do all the classrooms have exterior windows? Size of special spaces like kindergarten rooms, music and art spaces. And by and large, our overall findings were that the educational adequacy is comparable to what we would size in a newly constructed building. So it further confirmed our original recommendation of renovating Kinsner. Then as we looked at Muraski, again, we had studied what the best use of this site might be, and the portion of the building that is in the best condition is the portion that was built in 2005, which we showed here in green and blue. So this star is the entry next to the gymnasium. So you're seeing that corridor here in this photo. And that's kind of the dividing line of where we would maintain this portion of the building with the gymnasium and the classrooms that sit around the gymnasium. And then we would demo and build new onto this. So the idea would be that we would repurpose this portion of the building largely for the central admin and board functions. And then we would build on new anything that would be needed for the pre-K spaces for our district. So this would be a partial renovation, a partial demolition, and a partial addition. So this is a draft of our plan costs. These are preliminary and will be finalized over the next month, but we want to share them out so that you can kind of see where we are to date. And this is what the committee and the board have been made aware of. And so you can see we've got costs for the new buildings. We've got costs for abatement and demolition of Chapman, Whitney, Sarrar, and Zellers. We've got a budget together for renovations at Kinsner. And these aren't insignificant renovations. Kinsner, for example, would receive all new HVAC system. If anyone's familiar with that building, there's some issues with that system, as well as lots of other improvements throughout that facility. And then our partial demo, reno, and addition at Muraski. And then if it's the intent of the board to move forward with this plan and potentially seeing it on the ballot in March. As time goes on, we know the costs continue to rise. So we also have some inflation considered in this budget. So the total project cost for, again, this just covers really our pre-K through 5 portion of the building and a portion of the district, and our central office is around $136.5 million to do the scope as outlined above. So that's just for your kind of awareness of the type of ask of what the cost of constructing new buildings is this day, or this at this point in time. That kind of shifts our focus for a moment. You'll see, and if you've been paying attention to the little timeline across the bottom, we just been kind of trying to keep track of at what meetings we discussed what items. So we jump back to April for a minute, only because we weren't only thinking about the elementary schools in this process. We also were trying to keep track of other needs in the district, and those included athletic needs, performing arts needs, and we've already talked about the administration and preschool needs. So we were trying to make sure that we were able to kind of round out the work that has already been done with the middle school and the high school. So this was meant to capture other needs throughout the district. And as we were able to continue to move through what those other needs might be, we got a lot of great feedback from community members and our athletics folks about athletics needs. A lot of discussion about the potential opportunities and things that we would be able to do as a community with a field house. So we talked about what might be considered as part of a field house. And then we talked about some different needs at the stadium, between some potential lighting needs at the middle school stadium, and then some upgrades at the high school stadium that are still very much being fine-tuned and in conversation. But these just kind of capture what we heard as needs in the room through our community work. And then there were some performing arts needs that were identified by the group to enhance mostly the high school auditorium in terms of lighting and rigging that could be improved. And then some of the back of house functions, dressing areas, depth of stage, storage needs for drama and music. So we've been having more focused meetings with end users that fall under the athletics or the music and arts category to try to understand some of those additional needs as well. So if you total up those needs, again, this is as we kind of understood them in August. If you totaled up those potential other needs, we were at an additional cost of potentially $17 million of what we had heard to date. So $136.5 million on the elementary and pre-K side of the table, and then potential other needs already, looking at potentially $17 million. And again, trying to close the loop over the next month or so of, did we get everything into this other needs bucket and understand that correctly? So we're continuing to work through that process. We're going to ask for some feedback on these via survey as well from you all as the larger community. So that takes us to understanding what that could look like as an ask in the form of a potential bond issue. And so this is a table that was put together by the district's bond council, municipal council. And it's a chart that shows ballot millage, and it shows the potential bond size in millions across this line here. And then it shows potential years of maturity of that bond. And then it also has different assumptions for interest rates. So you can kind of get a sense per $100,000 home value what $120 to $150 million bond issue would look like, both in millage and in cost per $100,000 in home value. So you can kind of see that if I just look at this top line, it's $121 per $100,000 home value for $120 million bond issue, and about $151 per $100,000 of home value for $150 million bond issue. So we're starting to just kind of try to understand what that could mean and what these total project costs mean. I'm going to jump to next steps to make sure we have time for questions. So we obviously are having our meeting tonight, and then we will have a follow-up survey that will be open through the 29th to get your feedback on what we've reviewed tonight and the committee's work to date. We'll have our final facilities planning committee meeting on October 5th. The first time the board would officially act on this recommendation, should they choose to move forward with it, would be October 12th. And then if they make that action in October, that would set you up for a March 19th election day and potentially seeing something on the ballot. One final piece before we close for Q&A is Chris noted it when he was talking about the FIT plans, but I think it's important to reiterate that we really believe that we need to design with people and not just for people, both our team at GPD and the district. So as we move forward to the board potentially acting on this recommendation and then, potentially gaining support, and if we were ever to move forward into design on this project, there would be a much larger process that would unfold, that we would incorporate staff, student, and community feedback into specifics about how the sites would lay out, what the buildings could look like. We'll definitely need to get with teachers to understand how they want to teach within the buildings. And so that would, a whole nother engagement process would unfold, and it would be at least a year long, if not more. So there would be plenty of time for us to get feedback on those specific items. Because one whole other piece of this process is to consider who we're designing for and how we need to design and renovate these facilities. And that includes considering the fact that, we mentioned a lot of our buildings were built in the 50s. And, the folks going through the educational phase of their lives were the boomer generation at that time. And students born today live in a totally different world, with totally different technology, totally different needs, totally different ways of interacting with the world and learning. And we really can move, from rows of students all focused on one point of the teacher in the front of the room, and start to try to provide environments that can support all the different ways that students learn and think and grow in this century, which is quite different from last century. So in closing, we really just want to make sure that we are leaving the door open for lots of other conversations about what these educational spaces could look like and what opportunities they could provide for students. And so we just wanted to show some of the things that we, know we can do better in newer buildings: safety and security, efficiency, technology, flexibility. And again, the biggest thing I think is being able to support different teaching delivery methods and different ways of learning for students that are going through school now, but more importantly, for students who aren't even born yet, who will utilize these facilities moving forward. So with that, we will go into Q&A for a bit, I believe.
Thank you, Abby and Chris, for an informative presentation about the work that's been done by the Facilities Committee. I'm going to ask Dan Faust, our Communications Coordinator, to come on screen. And what we'll do for the last 10 or so minutes we have is Dan will share the question, and then I will either answer it or guide to one of my colleagues that could best answer it. So Dan, get us started.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Ryba. The first question is, what's the timeline for construction if this bond issue is passed?
Abby, Chris, I'll turn it over to you for that answer.
Sure. Once the bond issue is passed, the district would need to advertise for architects and construction managers. So there'd be some time kind of putting a team together. We've been brought on board as a pre-bond consultant. We would, the district would go through that process. And then you can assume that you would have between 12 and 18 months of design on a program of this kind of scale. And then you can assume that there would be probably about 24 months of construction. And I'll let Chris chime in if there's any other detail he wants to add into there.
Yeah, I agree with that, Abby. So yeah, I concur there.
So just if we put that all together as a timeline, possible bond in March based on, depending on what the board determines, if that's put on March, ballpark, when would schools be open for students to enter?
It would probably be about minimum 3 to 3.5 years after that, at that point in time.
Yeah, and that'd be assuming that the 3 new elementary schools are being constructed concurrently.
Thank you. Dan, next question.
So the next question is, if we're eliminating one elementary school in this proposed plan, how does this impact transportation and getting our students to school on time?
Mr. Breckner, I'm going to ask you to answer that question for us in terms of logistics of transportation going from 5 to 4 schools.
So if this was to pass, we would have to do of course, a study to see, but with the consolidation of schools from 5 to 4, we would be able to actually add more resources to the schools, maybe combine some buses that we can't while there's 5 schools instead of 4. So I don't see that being an issue. We would have to look at it and do a study, but I don't think it's anything that would be insurmountable.
Thank you, Mr. Breckner. Dan, next question.
Next question involves playgrounds. So based on some of the design proposed plans that were shown tonight, a lot of them include the playgrounds in front of the schools, which makes this individual nervous in terms of safety. Are there plans to fence these playgrounds in, or are there other ways to protect students in terms of layout for these proposed designs?
So I'm going to start us off, and Abby or Chris, if there's any other additions you want to add, please join in. In terms of playground layout, as Chris shared, these are fit plans. So these are very basic drafts of, can everything fit? Does that mean that's exactly where the playground is going to go? Obviously, we have to contend with existing buildings, and that makes space limited. But these are just initial designs. It doesn't mean that's where that is going to go in the final version. And then I would also add that we do have Whitney Elementary School in particular and Moraski have building or playgrounds or blacktop areas where kids play more of the side to front of the building. So we do have a variety of elementary schools that have a similar structure that our students are safe to play there. Anything else, Chris or Abby, that you would like to add in terms of playground safety and access and location that you've dealt with in your experience?
The only thing I would add is just the range of students we have between K to 5. When we lay out a playground, we're considering equipment for the littlest folks on the playground and equipment for some of the older folks. And then we typically do include fencing around portions of the play area, especially if there's like play surface with actual play equipment on it. So the question about fencing would certainly be something that we would consider and take into account when designing the playground.
With Chris's nod, I'm assuming Abby covered that question. So Dan, next one.
So this question has to do with the administration offices. So are the proposed switch of our admin offices to a new location, is that a need to have or just a want to have? If you can just maybe expand a little bit on the decision-making process for our administration offices to switch locations.
So this is a need to have in terms of the age of our facilities, the necessary dollars that would need to be invested in the administrative offices to keep it in good working order, and the efficiency of our overall organization. So although it was not as a part of the slides that Abby and Chris went through, they did the same analysis of Zellers as they did with all of the other elementary buildings. And the recommendation from there, I think it was, if memory serves, it was in the mid 70% range that it should not be renovated but replaced. The building, as we saw in capacity, could only hold 280 some students. And structurally, we're looking at buildings that we're in currently were designed with construction standards that were back in the 50s and 60s. And we do have some structural issues in the building as well. So as we take a look at the holistic needs of our facilities moving forward, we do have to find a solution to the challenges we're having in this building. We've also looked at, hey, do we need a new building, or Could we look at renting available space that's in the city? We went through that exercise last year with city officials. And because of the size of space that we would need and the available space in the city, there really isn't available space for us to go elsewhere. That's in more office building space versus industrial parks, which would not be conducive for our families. So it is not a want. It is a need as we take a look at hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not more, that would need to be invested into a 60-plus-year-old building in roofs, HVAC, structural concerns that are here. So it's proper planning and good overall financial prudence to take a look at this as a part of the bond issue. As well as we talked about meeting the needs of our preschool, since we are divided between two locations, we'll be able to solve both of those challenges by repurposing Muraski as was recommended by our committee.
Next question has to do with switching students from Muraski, that Muraski site, to the 4 proposed elementary schools in this plan. So how would they be distributed amongst the schools in the plan?
So that's another great question. And so when we take a look at if this plan as drafted moves forward, where we would go from 5 elementary schools to 4 elementary schools, we would look at how we would zone students based on population density, based on transportation logistics, all of these things in equal balance between 3 buildings that are built new for a little over 700 students and Kinsner Elementary that would be right-sized for 500 students. We would look at how we would address alignment and zoning of students to those buildings. So Muraski students, since that elementary building in this plan would no longer exist, those students based on different neighborhoods would be zoned to the other 4 elementary schools. But we would look at that holistically and take a look at elementary boundaries in the new structure that would be implemented once all of the new buildings are online. Dan, we've got about a couple more minutes, so if there's any other questions on the list, we can probably get to two or three more.
Yep, I've got a couple left. So based on the timeline that Abby and Chris shared in terms of passage of the bond issue and then opening of the schools after construction, what's being done to, or what will be done to address the space constraints while we're waiting for the new buildings to be constructed?
So we started this process last year, and if you recall, we put some changes into place. We centralized half-day kindergarten to be in 2 of our elementary schools instead of all 5 to open up those classrooms. We've converted some other space to build additional classrooms at Kinsner. We created a new music classroom. We've created some new intervention spaces in some of our other buildings. As well as the board gave the green light to put a mobile classroom at Chapman Elementary School this year to see for buildings that really did not have available space for K-5 classrooms, if that would alleviate some of the pressure. So though that will continue to be the plan, we've looked at a variety of options and we've landed on those options of centralizing half-day kindergarten to fewer buildings, looking at dividing up some of our usable space for increased classrooms, as well as starting with a mobile unit at Chapman. And if more mobile units are needed to address in the short term, that's something the board will consider in the future. But as we take a look at available space, those are the options that we have at our disposal until a time when new buildings are online.
Next question is there a proposed site for a potential field house in the district as the additional needs were shared by Abby and Chris?
So that's something, as Abby and Chris shared, that we've started to have preliminary discussions with different groups. So we met with representatives of our athletic team and a couple other folks in there. So there's no finalized location right now. We've got a few sites that we've taken a look at that we think would be conducive with access, parking, convenience to other athletic facilities. But that's something that's still being vetted at this time in terms of an exact proposed location.
Got the last question, Dr. Ryba, here of our questions coming in. Have we assessed the impact on pickup and drop off with larger increases in students at a single building? So what's going to be the impact of more students at a building and the parent pickup and drop off at those locations?
Abby or Chris, you want to talk about how you design buildings and parking and drop-offs and pickups to accommodate 700 students?
Sure. So during the initial preliminary design phases, we would do a traffic study to determine what kind of issues we may run into for that increased student count, if there would need to be any widening of the road to incorporate a turn lane, that kind of stuff. And obviously going from, say, an elementary school that's 400 or 500 kids up to 708, yeah, it's going to be a lot higher water demands, a lot higher sanitary and storm demands. So we would likely be bringing in new utilities from the road, larger pipes. And those pipes are decades old anyhow. So to go through and construct a new facility and not replace the incoming underground utilities, it's not something that we typically do. That would all be replaced in one fell swoop to ensure that those utilities could adequately serve those larger buildings.
And I think in terms of pickup and drop off, some of our, standard principles are considering bus pickup and drop off as completely separate from parent pickup and drop off. And as much as we are able, we really like to make sure that parent pickup and drop off can be handled on our site via loops for that pickup and drop off of students that are going to have parents dropping them off. And then the parking lot blocks on our FIT plan, we size those according to the amount of parking that would be needed for staff members and visitors to a larger building. We weren't replacing one for one with the amount of parking that was on that site. So in our FIT planning, we were taking some of those loops and some of those parking increases into account when we were doing those FIT plans.
Thank you. And I think Dan said that was our final question to cover tonight. Abby, if you can scroll back to the next steps as we wrap up here tonight. So again, I want to thank everybody for engaging with us. As Abby shared, we have the community meeting tonight. Tomorrow, we will send out a survey to all of our parents and community members, and we'll share that survey with the Post to put on their online edition. Because this is truly a draft plan that's been created by stakeholders like you, parents, community members, staff that are invested in our school district and want to have a voice. And so I would encourage everybody to share your feedback via that survey. On October 5th, our Elementary Facilities Planning Committee, that 60-member team plus our 50 key communicators are going to take a look at all of this feedback and answer that question. Do we need to make adjustments or tweaks or changes or rethink some of the aspects of our plan based on our community feedback? And that's going to drive the final recommendation from this group to be presented to the board on October 12th. So once again, thank you for engaging with us tonight. Thank you to members of our district team and GPD team for being with us and sharing. And please have your voices heard. Be a part of the process. Share your insights and expertise and feedback, no matter what your role is in Strongsville, because we're going to get to a better plan because of you and in your engagement with us. So once again, thank you for being with us tonight. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the future about our elementary facilities as well as facility needs as a whole. Have a wonderful evening.